A single father, a child, and a bride left behind in the rain. They were strangers, until one day changed everything. If you believe that family isn't just blood, but the people we choose to stand beside, then this story is meant for you. Tap like if something here moves you, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story of healing, hope, and home, because sometimes a story is all it takes to warm a whole day. The rain had started without warning, cold, clean, and punishing. It tapped relentlessly against the metal awning above the train station, drumming out the final thoughts from David's head as he walked with his son through the soaked parking lot. Ethan held tightly to his father's calloused hand, small fingers wrapped around worn denim. The boy didn't complain about the rain. He never did. He'd grown used to quiet, to making himself small, to the way silence had lived with them ever since his mother died. David kept his gaze low, fixed on the puddles forming in the cracked concrete. Work at the garage had run late again. A stubborn old Chevy that refused to start. He had grease on his cuffs and oil beneath his nails, and all he wanted was to get back to the tiny room behind the shop, heat up canned soup, and not think too hard. Then he saw her. She sat beneath the rusted beam of Platform 9, soaked through, knees drawn in, clutching a suitcase to her chest like it held the last bit of her life. A wedding dress clung to her like second skin, heavy with rain, the train trailing across the dirt-caked tiles. Her hair was plastered to her face, her arms trembling, and her eyes weren't asking for help. They'd gone beyond that. "Daddy," Ethan whispered. "Why is she crying?" David didn't stop walking. "It's not our business," he muttered. "But she looks like Mommy did." That night, David stopped. He hadn't expected that. He wasn't sure Ethan even remembered. But something in the boy's voice hit bone. He turned back, eyes lingering on the woman. The station was empty this time of evening. No trains till morning, no staff, no one else around. The woman didn't look up. "Wait here," David told Ethan. He approached slowly, keeping his distance. "You all right, miss?" She flinched slightly at the sound of his voice but didn't answer. "You waiting for someone?" Still nothing. Only the soft sound of her breathing, ragged and shallow. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he added gently. "Just, it's cold out, and the rain's not letting up." She looked up then, and David's heart stuttered. Not because she was beautiful, though she was even beneath the ruin of tears and mascara, but because there was nothing left behind her gaze. No hope, no fear, just absence. "I'm not waiting for anyone," she said, voice flat. "There's no one coming." David exhaled. "I've got a room behind the garage. Not much, a place to dry off. Warm up, that's all." She blinked as if the offer took a moment to reach her. "I'm fine." "You're not," he replied. She hesitated, and for the briefest second her shoulders dropped. Not in surrender, but in exhaustion. David shrugged out of his jacket and laid it over her shoulders without waiting for permission. "You don't have to come if you don't want to," he said, "but the boy and I are heading there now. If you change your mind." He turned back toward Ethan. But before he'd taken more than a few steps, he heard the sound of her suitcase dragging across the concrete behind him. They walked in silence. The door of the garage, David pushed it open and held it for her. She ducked inside, soaked and shivering, as Ethan handed her the towel he always used when he forgot his raincoat. "I'm Isabel," she said softly, almost out of breath. "David, this is Ethan." She nodded at the boy, her lips twitching, toward a smile she didn't quite reach. Inside, the room smelled faintly of motor oil and coffee. The floor was rough wood, the lighting dim, but it was warm. David put the kettle on while Isabel sat by the heater, clutching the towel close. Her dress was still damp, clinging to her like it didn't want to let go. He offered her dry clothes, his late wife's sweatshirt and pajama pants. She didn't ask whose they were. She took them into the bathroom, changed, and when she returned, she looked less like a ghost. Dinner was scrambled eggs and toast. No one talked much, but the silence wasn't sharp anymore. It was tired, shared. Later, Isabel sat on the edge of the cot while Ethan curled up with his stuffed bear. David laid out blankets on the floor and turned off the light. Rain still whispered against the window. "You didn't have to," Isabel said into the dark. "Let me in." "I know. Why did you?" David lay still. The floor was hard, his heart harder. "I don't know," he said at last. "Maybe because someone didn't. Once. And I remember what that felt like." She didn't respond. But she didn't leave. And somewhere in the space between breath and silence, David knew. Something had shifted. He didn't know what this was. But for the first time in 3 years, it wasn't nothing. David hadn't slept. Not really. He'd closed his eyes. He'd listened to the rain. He'd listened to Ethan's slow, even breaths. He'd listened to the soft sound of Isabel shifting on the cot. But sleep never came. His body ached in all the old ways, shoulder tight from years under hoods of broken engines, a dull burn still surfacing sometimes from the scar on his left side, a remnant of the fire that took his home and his wife. But the real weight pressing down on his chest wasn't physical. It was her. The woman in the other room. The one in the wedding dress. The one he let in. The kettle hissed as he poured water into 2 chipped mugs. He stirred sugar into one. He didn't know how she took it, but most people didn't mind sweet in the morning. He didn't bother with his, just black, always black. The door creaked. Isabel stepped out, hair damp but brushed back, the sleeves of his wife's old sweatshirt pulled over her hands. She paused when she saw the mugs. "You didn't have to." He didn't look at her. "I know." She walked over, accepted the cup with both hands. Steam rose between them. For a moment, they just stood there, 2 strangers, feet apart, sharing warmth that had nothing to do with tea. Ethan stirred on the cot behind them, still half lost in dreams. "He's a good kid," Isabel murmured. David nodded. "Takes after his mom." She didn't press, and he didn't offer more. He watched her sip the tea, eyes fixed somewhere past the wall. Her hand still trembled, just slightly, the way a wire hums after lightning strikes. He cleared his throat. "You said you didn't have anywhere to go." "I don't," he waited. She added, "There was supposed to be a wedding yesterday." David didn't flinch, just listened. He didn't show. Called it off in a voicemail, said he'd changed his mind, that I'd always been more of a favor than a fiancé. His parents thought marrying me would keep me out of trouble. I think he just wanted to feel like a hero. Her voice was even, too even, like someone reading a story from someone else's life. "I packed everything into that suitcase," she continued, "left the shelter where I was staying, put on the dress like they told me. I waited. He didn't come, so I ran." David's fingers curled around his mug. "I'm sorry," she added, quieter now. "I shouldn't have brought that here." He shook his head. "It's not that." "Then what?" "I'm just trying to figure out if I'm being stupid," he said honestly, "letting you stay." Her eyes didn't flinch. She nodded. "I wouldn't blame you if you told me to go." Silence again. Rain started to fall outside, a light, hesitant tapping like it wasn't sure it was welcome back. "I got nothing," David said after a while. "Just this room, this boy. A job that barely pays for the food on that table." "That's more than I had yesterday," she said. Something in that answer cut through him. He looked at her. Really looked. The wedding dress was gone, folded neatly beside the cot. She stood in a borrowed sweatshirt, in a room that wasn't hers, with a suitcase that held everything she owned. And still, she wasn't begging. She wasn't pleading. She was bracing for the door. David hated that look. He'd worn it himself once. "You can stay," he said. Her mouth parted just slightly. "Not forever," he added. "Not yet, but a little while, until you figure things out." Her shoulders sank. The breath she'd been holding finally exhaled. Thank you. He nodded. Ethan will be glad. I won't get in the way. You already are, he said. But that's not always a bad thing. She smiled. Barely. But it was the first real one he'd seen. Later that day, after David returned from the garage, he found Isabel and Ethan sitting on the floor, drawing with broken crayons. She looked up, startled, as if she'd been caught doing something forbidden. He wanted to show me how to draw a dog, she said. David looked at the scribble. It looked more like a possum with boots. It's got character, he said, deadpan. Ethan beamed. That night they ate soup with crackers and watched the wind shake the window panes. Isabel tucked Ethan into the cot, read a bedtime story from a worn-out picture book she found in the donation box by the gas station. David sat on the floor and listened. She had a gentle voice, patient and quiet. The kind you had to lean in to hear. Later, once Ethan had drifted off, David stood by the doorway, unsure if he should speak. You have a way with him, he finally said. I grew up in foster homes, she replied. Kids don't forget what it feels like to need someone. David looked at the boy, clutching his bear in sleep. Then he looked at her. You can stay, he repeated, longer if you want. And though she didn't say a word in return, she nodded, and it felt, for the first time in years, like something had clicked into place. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn. David stood by the back door of the garage, a chipped enamel mug warming his hands. The air outside still carried a wet chill, but the sky was turning that pale, forgiving shade of blue, the kind that only showed up after long storms. Inside, the quiet felt different now. Not emptier. Just fuller, in a way he hadn't felt in years. He could hear the soft rustle of blankets, the hum of the little space heater Ethan always kicked at in his sleep. Isabel's voice, low and sweet, reading the last page of a picture book again because Ethan had asked her to. Again. David hadn't asked her to do any of it. She just did. He took another sip and watched as a sparrow landed on the windowsill, shook the raindrops from its feathers and flew off. That small act of resilience reminded him, sharply, that healing never came loudly. It came like that, quiet, unnoticed and in motion. When he stepped back inside, Isabel looked up. I thought you'd already left for work, she said softly. Boss gave me the morning off. David lied. Not entirely. He'd traded shifts with Jason, the high school kid who worked weekends. Figured he needed a day to think. Isabel sat cross-legged on the floor in one of his old flannel shirts, sleeves rolled 3 times. Her hair was braided, back now, her face a little less pale. Ethan leaned against her, half asleep still, thumb in his mouth and a crayon gripped in his other hand. David raised a brow at the paper in front of them. That a spaceship? It's our house, Ethan said proudly. Really? David crouched down beside them. I didn't know our house had a tire swing. It doesn't, Ethan shrugged. But it could. David glanced at Isabel. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Not yet. He looked back at the drawing and something in his chest shifted. A tire swing, a chimney, a porch with flowers. Things Ethan had never known but still believed they could have. Do you miss her? Isabel asked suddenly. He didn't. Have to ask who. David stared at the drawing. Every day. Silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was honest. She was good, he said finally. Brighter than me. Kinder than I deserved. She died 3 days after we lost the house. Cancer took what the bank hadn't. Isabel lowered her gaze. I thought I'd buried everything with her, he said. Turns out, grief has a long shelf life. She nodded, brushing her hand through Ethan's curls. You're not the only one with ghosts. David looked at her. Really looked. She sat like someone still ready to run. Her body relaxed, but her eyes never stopped scanning the exits. Even here, in this quiet, with warmth and food and company, she was ready for the other shoe to drop. You got people? He asked gently. Isabel shook her head. No one who'd call themselves that. She told him pieces then, not the whole story but enough. The shelters, the foster homes, the pastor who gave her a cot one winter, and the woman who taught her to sew. How she worked 2 jobs and still ended up depending on the kindness of a man who eventually saw her as property. I kept telling myself it was love, she whispered, until I couldn't anymore. David didn't speak, just nodded, sat with it. Some things didn't need fixing. Some things just needed to be witnessed. By noon, they were outside. The clouds had thinned, and the sun warmed the damp ground with soft fingers of gold. Ethan chased a paper airplane across the gravel behind the garage, laughing in that free, honest way only kids could. David and Isabel sat on an overturned crate. She sipped lemonade from a jelly jar. He watched the boy. I don't think he remembers the worst of it, David said. But he remembers enough to be careful. Isabel nodded. He doesn't ask for much. No, but he deserves more. She was quiet for a moment, then said, We all do. The words hung there, simple but heavy. David cleared his throat. There's an old trailer out behind the junkyard. Belonged to the owner's son. He left town a few years back. Been empty since. She looked at him. I could clean it up, he said. Maybe get the heater working. Wouldn't be much, but it'd be yours. Isabel's brows lifted, startled. Why? Because you don't belong on a train platform in the rain. She looked away, blinking hard. I don't want to be a charity case. You're not. Then what am I? David paused. A person who deserves a second chance. Isabel didn't answer right away. She just watched Ethan, who was now trying to tie his paper plane to a string like a kite. Okay, she said finally. But I want to help fix it. He smiled, just a little. Deal. That evening they ate on the steps behind the garage, grilled cheese and canned tomato soup. The sky above them blushed orange and violet. Isabel leaned back, eyes closed, letting the last light touch her skin. David watched her. She looked different now. Not whole, not healed, but rooted. Like maybe, just maybe. She was done running. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for tonight there was quiet, shelter, and something fragile beginning to bloom. The trailer behind the junkyard wasn't much. Tin siding, warped floors, windows fogged with old grime. But it had good bones, David said. Isabel could tell he meant more than the frame. They spent the better part of 2 days cleaning it out. Ethan helped in the way that only children can, enthusiastically, making more mess than he cleaned but beaming with pride all the while. David brought tools from the garage. Isabel brought patience. Between them, something started to resemble a home. On the 3rd morning, she woke early, stepping out barefoot onto the soft gravel. The trailer door creaked and dew kissed the soles of her feet. Across the lot, David was already working, sleeves rolled, repairing the steps with measured hammer strikes. You ever stop? She called. He didn't turn. Only when it's raining. She walked toward him slowly, the sun just rising behind her. You didn't have to do all this. I know, he said. But it helps. What does? Fixing things. Isabel sat on the edge of the wooden frame he was building. Even the things that don't want to be fixed? He finally looked at her. Especially those. Smiled, but it faded too quickly. Can I ask you something? She said. David nodded. When the house burned, were you inside? He paused, hand gripping the hammer. Yeah, he said softly. Just me. My wife had already passed. I was trying to get back a few things. Photo albums. Her sweater. Did you get them? He shook his head. I got out. That's it. The silence between them tightened. Is that where the scar came from? She asked, gently now. He nodded. Again, I saw it, the first night, when you took your shirt off for bed. He didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. I didn't mean to look, she added quickly. I recognized something. What's that? That kind of pain. the kind that sticks. Later that day, Isabel found a box tucked deep in the trailer's cabinet. Inside was an old photo album left behind by the previous tenant. Most of the pictures had faded, but one, a woman on a swing smiling at the camera, stayed with her. She didn't know why she showed it to David. Maybe because it reminded her of something she hadn't felt in years. The hope of being remembered. He held the picture gently as if afraid it might break in his fingers. "I used to think healing would feel like forgetting," he said. "And now I think it feels more like remembering differently." That evening, David found her by the tree stump near the back fence, sitting with a cup of tea in her lap. Ethan was inside the trailer, fast asleep after a day full of dirt and drawing and sunlight. The moon was just rising, round and pale and impossibly steady. "I lied to you," Isabel said. David stayed quiet. She kept her eyes forward. "About the wedding, about the man." He sat beside her, careful not to push. He wasn't just some cold-footed fiancé. He was the son of the family who sponsored the shelter I was staying in. They gave me work, helped me get on my feet. I thought, her voice caught. I thought they saw me, but I was just another good deed to them. David said nothing. When he proposed, I wanted to believe it was love. I needed it to be. I didn't see how much they needed me small, grateful, contained. She turned toward him now. When I ran, I wasn't running from a man. I was running from the version of me they tried to make permanent. David met her gaze. He didn't flinch. "You're here now," he said simply. "But for how long?" she asked. "You fixed the heater, gave me a roof, a second chance, and I'm scared of ruining that." He exhaled slowly. "You're not a project, Isabel. I'm not fixing you." "Then what are you doing?" He looked down at his hands, still stained with oil and memory. "Trying to be someone who doesn't walk away." That night, Isabel cried. Not the silent tears of someone trying not to be a burden, but the deep, shaking sobs of someone who had held too much for too long, with nowhere for it to go. David didn't speak. He sat across the room, hands folded, head bowed, not in prayer, but in presence. When she finally looked up, her eyes swollen and red, he only asked, "Want me to stay?" She nodded. He didn't move closer, didn't touch her. He just stayed. And somehow that was more than enough. Sometime before dawn, the wind shifted. Outside the trailer, a broken shutter tapped against the siding. Inside, the air was still. Ethan stirred once in his sleep. Isabel pulled the blanket over him, tucking it beneath his chin. Then she looked at David, curled awkwardly in the armchair, neck bent, mouth slightly open. A flicker passed across her face. Not gratitude, recognition, and, maybe, the start of trust. The trailer smelled like cinnamon and dust. Isabel had found an old tin of spice in the back of a cabinet and stirred it into oatmeal that morning, declaring the kitchen officially open for business. David pretended to grumble about the smell lingering on his shirt, but when Ethan scraped his bowl clean and asked for seconds, David didn't miss the way her eyes lit up. They sat together on the steps afterward, bathed in the pale morning sun. The air was crisp. Leaves skittered across the gravel like whispers. Isabel sipped from her tea jar. David held a coffee mug that had once said, "Or one dad," but had faded until only the outline of the one remained. Ethan was building a fort, out of cardboard boxes behind the garage. Every few minutes he popped his head out to give them an update. "The roof's gonna be made of sticks," or "No girls allowed unless you bring cookies." "Should we be worried he's setting up his own nation?" David asked, glancing sideways. Isabel smiled. "He has a good imagination. He used to draw monsters in the corners of every room," David said. "Said they were easier to see when things were quiet." "Does he still?" "Not since you got here." That silenced them both in a soft, thoughtful way. That afternoon, David fixed a broken drawer in the trailer's tiny kitchen. Isabel sorted through donated clothes from the church bin, cutting up the ones too worn to wear and sewing them into little cushion covers for the window seat. She hummed while she worked. Just a tune. No words. But it filled the space like sunlight. Phil's old glass, slow and golden. David paused mid-hammer, watching her. "You do that often?" he asked. "What?" Sing." She shrugged. "Used to. Back when I thought it might lead somewhere. And now? Now it's just noise that makes me feel like I'm still here." He nodded. "It suits the room." Later, David brought home lumber scraps from the garage. They stacked them behind the trailer, planning a small raised bed for vegetables. "Too late this year," he said, "but next spring maybe carrots, tomatoes, something stubborn." They dug out the patch anyway, just dirt and dreams. But Isabel smiled as her fingers pressed into the soil. "You think this'll last?" she asked without looking up. David stood over her, one hand shielding his eyes from the sun. "No," he said, "but I'm still building it." She looked up then. Really. Looked, and something unspoken passed between them. Not a promise, but an understanding. That night, the three of them sat at the rickety table inside the trailer. David had fixed the leg with an old broom handle and duct tape. Isabel made stew with carrots, beans, and a pinch of something warm. Ethan insisted on lighting a single tea candle in the middle so it feels like a real dinner. And it did. They talked about nothing. That kind of soft, unimportant conversation that only happens when people feel safe. The way Ethan liked orange cereal, but not orange juice. How David once drove a car off a lift by accident. How Isabel hated the sound of zippers but loved the sound of wind. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a turning point. But it mattered. Because for the first time in too long, dinner felt like home. After Ethan fell asleep, David and Isabel stood, outside in the chill, watching clouds drift across the stars. The moon cast a silver glow over the clearing. A stray breeze tugged at the hem of her sweater. "I was married once," she said suddenly. David turned to her. "Yeah? Not legally, not on paper. But I lived with someone. A man who said all the right things until he didn't. He didn't. Press. Sometimes I wonder if there's a version of me still trapped there. Quiet. Apologetic. Forgetting how to exist without being given permission." David shifted his weight. "Maybe. But the version I see planted a garden bed today." She looked at him, half grateful, half scared. "What do you see when you look at yourself?" David was quiet. "I see a man still carrying ash," he finally said. "But also, a man who's learning to open windows again." She smiled. "That's poetic. I'll deny it in court." Before going in for the night, Isabel knelt by the garden bed. In the center, she pushed a seed into the soil, just one, then covered it gently. "What's that?" David asked. "Hope," she said. He watched her, something aching behind his ribs. "You don't think it's too early?" he asked. She stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "It's always too early until it's not." That night, as David lay on the makeshift cot, sleep heavy on his shoulders, he heard Ethan mumble in his sleep, "Daddy, can she stay forever?" David didn't answer, but in the dark his hand reached across the empty space between the two cots and found hers. She didn't pull away, and neither of them said a word. The knock came just after lunch. 3 sharp raps, confident, exact, like someone used to being answered. David froze in the middle of slicing an apple. The kitchen knife paused against the wood, the sound of the knock still echoing in his chest. Isabel had been humming in the next room, folding Ethan's laundry on the couch. The melody stopped. The trailer had never felt smaller. Ethan, sitting, cross-legged on the floor with a puzzle, looked up. "Are we expecting someone?" David set the knife down slowly. "No, buddy. Why don't you go grab your jacket? We'll check the garden after." The boy hesitated, sensing something, but nodded and scampered off. David opened the door. He was taller than David expected. Younger, too, dressed in a fitted coat, dark jeans, polished boots. The kind of clean that didn't belong around here. David. Whitaker? The man asked with a clipped tone. Who's asking? My name's Garrett. I believe Isabel is staying here. David didn't blink. You believe wrong. Behind him, a breath caught. Isabel had stepped into the hallway. One look at her face told David everything he needed to know. She knew. This man. And she was afraid. I'm not here to cause trouble, Garrett said, his voice too smooth. I just want to talk. She left in a state of distress and my family's worried. Isabel stepped forward then, her voice low but firm. Your family wasn't worried when they told me I had 30 minutes to get out of the house. Garrett's smile faltered. You misunderstood. No, she said, shaking her head. I didn't. David watched her hands, clenched tightly at her sides, the way her shoulders curled inward. She looked smaller than she had in weeks. Garrett tried. Again. Look, I know this is messy, but there are legal documents involved. Financial arrangements, my parents, they're not unreasonable, they just want to make sure things end cleanly. She's not property, David said, stepping between them. Garrett's jaw tightened. This doesn't concern you. It does now. For a moment, no one spoke. The breeze kicked up a swirl of dust around Garrett's shoes. He looked down, then back at David. You should be careful about getting involved in things you don't understand. I understand enough, David said quietly. Now leave. Garrett's gaze lingered on Isabel, cold and calculating, before he turned and walked away without another word. Inside, David locked the door. Then the windows. Then sat at the edge of the couch, staring at nothing. I'm sorry, Isabel said softly. I didn't know he'd find me. You don't have to apologize. Yes, I do. You took me in, let me near your son. You didn't ask questions. And you told me enough, David said, his voice a low rumble. You told me what mattered. She sat down beside him, hands twisting in her lap. They never signed anything official. There's no real marriage certificate. But his family has money, lawyers, and they don't like losing control. David's shoulders stiffened. Is he dangerous? She hesitated. No, not the way you're thinking. But he's relentless. And he doesn't lose. David didn't reply. Instead, he stood, moved to the small window, and looked out across the gravel drive. The trees beyond swayed with the wind. I've lost before, he said. Everything. Housewife my name, but not this, not you. Isabel blinked, startled. David turned back. His voice didn't rise, but it carried weight. If he comes again, I won't step aside. If this goes legal, we'll find help. If it gets loud, we'll get louder. She stared at him. Why? Because I won't lose the second chance I never thought I'd get. That night, tension hung in the trailer like smoke. Ethan picked up on it. He didn't ask questions, but he stayed close to David, tucked beside him on the cot while Isabel cooked in silence. When the candle on the table burned too low, no one replaced it. When dinner ended, no one reached for seconds. Later, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Isabel sat at the edge of her bed, head bowed. Maybe I should go, she whispered. Maybe if I leave, he'll stop. David sat beside her. No. You don't understand. I do, he said. I know what it's like to think you bring danger with you, to believe that walking away might protect the people you care about. But that's not love, Isabel, that's fear. She looked up at him, eyes glistening. He reached for her hand. If you run now, you'll keep running. Maybe forever. Or we can stay. Stand our ground together. She was silent a long moment, then softly. You're not afraid? He let out a dry laugh. I'm terrified. She managed a smile. Me too. Then we're in good company. Before bed, David stepped outside one last time. The garden bed sat quiet beneath the moonlight. A single sprout had broken the soil, just a tiny green shoot, almost nothing. But it was there, alive. He reached down and pressed his hand into the dirt, cool, damp, Real. Inside, Isabel watched him from the window. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for tonight, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't alone anymore. It started with a phone call. David had just opened the garage for the day when the landline rang, an old rotary model that hadn't buzzed in months. The voice on the other end was low, professional and cold. "We're calling regarding the woman known as Isabel Moore. As her previous guardians and benefactors, the Millerton family is moving forward with legal reclamation of funds and assets connected to her departure. We suggest you prepare counsel." The line went dead before David could speak. He stood there for a long time, the receiver humming in his hand, the scent of motor oil suddenly too thick. That afternoon, Garrett returned. Not alone this time. He brought two men in tailored coats standing like shadows beside him on the edge of the trailer property. They didn't speak. Just stood there, silent judgment in human form. David stepped out from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. Isabel stood behind the trailer door, watching through the narrow window. "We've been patient," Garrett began, voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "But she's taken things that don't belong to her. My family has a legal interest in seeing them returned." "She's not a thing," David said, "and she's not going anywhere. You're not in a position to decide that." David stepped forward, eyes locked. "Then let's make it simple. You step off this property and you don't come back." Garrett gave a tight, knowing smile. "You really think this ends in your favor?" David didn't blink. "I don't care how it ends, I care what's right." One of the suited men reached into his coat, not for a weapon but for a stack of papers. "A cease and desist," Garrett said. "Formal notice. She has 48 hours to vacate and return the assets. If not, we pursue damages." David didn't take the papers. He didn't move. He just said, steady and clear, "You want to drag her back, you'll have to go through me." Garrett raised an eyebrow. "And what are you? A mechanic with a burned-down house and a past he's still hiding from?" David exhaled. Then he said quietly, "Not anymore." That night, the town gathered. It started with Mrs. Hendricks from the bakery, who brought a pie to Isabel, just in case things got hard. Then came Sheriff Coleman, off duty but with his badge clipped to his coat, asking gently if Isabel needed help filing a restraining order. Then Jason from the garage, who offered to run errands, in case you two need to lie low for a while. David hadn't asked for any of it, but they came anyway. Word traveled fast in small towns. And kindness, it turned out, traveled faster. Later, after everyone had gone, Isabel sat on the front steps of the trailer. Ethan was asleep inside, a dream still curled around his small smile. David joined her, handing her a cup of tea. She looked at him for a long time. "You didn't have to stand up to him." "I know. He could ruin you." "I've been ruined before." "Then why?" David stared out at the darkened garden where the tiny green sprout had grown just a little taller today. "Because I've lost things I didn't fight for," he said. "I'm not making that mistake again." A pause, then, "You're worth the risk." Her breath caught. "I'm not," she whispered. "I've never been." He turned to her. "Then let me show you." She kissed him, not like in the movies. Not slow, not choreographed. It was tentative, a little messy, and entirely real. A woman who didn't trust herself reaching for a man who didn't think he deserved to be reached for. When they pulled apart, David rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know what this is yet," he said, "but I know I'm staying." She closed her eyes. "So am I." The next morning, Garrett didn't return. The cease and desist never materialized into court dates or police visits. Maybe it was the sheriff's quiet warning. Maybe it was the line of neighbors who took turns parking their cars outside the trailer that night. Maybe it was the quiet refusal of a small town to let someone be dragged back into something they finally escaped. Whatever it was, it held. And so did they. The smell hit first. It wasn't the comforting kind. The scent of wood smoke, curling from a neighbor's chimney, or the crisp tang of burning leaves in October. No, this was harsher. blacker, chemical. David was in the garage, elbow deep in a radiator, when his phone buzzed. One word lit the screen. Fire. By the time he got there, flames had eaten through the back half of the trailer. Smoke poured from shattered windows. The small garden bed, his and Isabel's quiet dream, was scorched and flattened beneath boot prints. A firefighter turned him back at the edge of the lot. "We got everyone out," she said. "The boy and the woman are safe." David didn't ask about the furniture, or the walls they had scrubbed clean, or the cushions she'd sewn by hand. He didn't ask about the sprout, or the books, or the tiny paper family Ethan had drawn and taped to. The fridge, he just asked, "Where are they?" They were standing in the parking lot behind the diner. Isabel had a blanket draped around her shoulders. Soot smeared her face. Ethan clung to her, face buried in her side. David ran to them. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She shook her head. "We were out front when it started. I smelled it first. The smoke. There wasn't time for much." David crouched down, gripping Ethan's shoulders. "Buddy, you okay?" The boy nodded, eyes wide. Too quiet. David wrapped them, both in his arms. There weren't words for this. Not yet. That evening, what was left of the trailer still smoldered. Sheriff Coleman stood beside David, both men silent as the embers hissed. "Accelerant," Coleman muttered, nudging a scorched beam with his boot. "My gut says arson. I'll dig." David didn't respond. Coleman looked over. "You thinking Garrett?" David's jaw clenched. "We can't prove it. Not unless someone saw something." David finally said low, "He doesn't need to come back. He got what he wanted." "No," the sheriff replied. "He didn't." That night, Isabel and Ethan slept in the back room of the church. The cots were hard. The air held the faint scent of disinfectant and old wood polish. But it was warm. It was safe. David sat on a bench outside, wrapped in his own thoughts. The stars overhead felt cruel, shining with indifference. Pastor June approached quietly. She was in her 60s, weathered by years of funerals, baptisms, and the in-between. "She told me," she said, sitting beside him, "about what she left, about what she found here." David nodded. "She also told me," Pastor June continued, "that you were the first person who ever made her feel seen." He blinked hard. "I thought I could protect them," he whispered. "You did," she said gently. "You still are." He looked at her then. "What do I do now?" "You build again." He shook his head. "With what?" "Start with your hands. The rest will follow." The next morning the sun rose slow and soft. David stood outside the remains of the trailer, ash crunching beneath his boots. The garden was gone. The beds, the shelves, the pictures, gone. But something stood out amid the gray. A small green shoot. Burned at the edges, bent, but alive. He knelt, and without thinking he touched the fragile stalk, like it might recognize him. A sound behind him. Isabel. She walked slowly, arms wrapped around herself. Eyes red from smoke. Or maybe something deeper. "They said we could stay at the church for a while," she said quietly. David nodded. "We will." She looked at him and something in her cracked. "I'm sorry," she said. "I brought this." He stood. "No," he said. "You brought light and laughter and music. You brought family." She shook her head. "Look around." "I am." He pointed behind her. She turned. Neighbors were arriving. Mrs. Hendricks from the bakery, Jason from the garage, Sheriff Coleman, the woman who ran the flower shop, the couple who owned the diner. One by one they came, with tools, gloves, tarps, and wood. "We heard you need help," someone said. David blinked. They weren't asking. They were already beginning. Ethan arrived, sleepy-eyed, a toy hammer in hand. "Want to build something," he said. David picked him up. "You will," he whispered. "We all will." That night, the three of them stood before an empty patch of earth. charred, blackened, ruined, but not hopeless, and not alone. It started with a hammer. Jason, the teenager from the garage, was the first to swing it. He drove a nail into the fresh plank of the new trailer frame, tongue poked slightly from the corner of his mouth like a child concentrating on a puzzle. When the nail went in straight, everyone around him clapped like he'd won a medal. David stood nearby, a circular saw in his hands and disbelief on his face. He'd drawn up plans the night before, not because he thought anyone would help, but because his hands didn't know how to be still. He expected to build it alone. Again. But they came. They kept coming. Sheriff Coleman brought his toolbox and a borrowed generator. Mrs. Hendricks showed up with muffins, gloves, and stories about her late husband's crooked-as-sin porch that she still missed. Pastor June brought folding chairs and lemonade. And when someone asked, "What are we building?" David found himself saying something he hadn't dared in years: a home. By noon, the foundation was laid. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't even a proper trailer yet, just a rectangular frame, leveled by 2 volunteers with sunburns and bad knees. But it was real, tangible. Ethan had claimed one corner as his room and had started measuring it with a stick, announcing grand designs for a bookshelf that would hold at least 27 dinosaurs. Isabel sat on a makeshift stool nearby, a bandana covering her hair, a hammer across her lap. She hadn't spoken much, but the quiet wasn't sadness. It was awe. Every time someone handed her a board or asked for her opinion, she looked surprised. Like she still hadn't quite accepted she mattered enough to be included. David noticed. And when she bent to pick up a 2x4, he walked over, gently touched her elbow. "You good?" She looked up, smiled. "Yeah. Just waiting for someone to wake me up." "This is real," he said softly. "How do you know?" "Because the coffee's bad and my back hurts. Nothing else feels this honest." She laughed then, light and full, and something inside him eased. That evening, the group stayed. They grilled hot dogs over a borrowed fire pit. Someone brought out an old guitar. There were no speeches, no grand toasts, just tired people in dusty clothes, eating with their hands, laughing about nothing. Ethan fell asleep in Isabel's lap, head tucked against her ribs, mouth still sticky with ketchup. David sat across the fire, watching her. In the low light, her eyes reflected flame, and the curve of her smile held no fear. He rose, crossed to her. "You're glowing," he said. She looked down at Ethan, stroked his hair. "Must be the mustard." David sat beside her. They said nothing for a while, the kind of silence that's earned, not awkward. Finally, she asked, "Do you think it's really possible?" "What?" "To stay, to stop running." He leaned back, looking up at the sky. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if we fail, it won't be because we didn't try." She nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For choosing me." He turned to her, his voice quiet. "Every day." Later, as stars scattered across the sky, David tucked Ethan into the cot inside the church rec room. Isabel leaned in the doorway, arms crossed over her chest, watching them. "He's had worse nights," she said softly. "I know," David replied. "But I still hate that he's had any." Isabel crossed the room, rested a hand on David's shoulder. "You're a good father." He looked up at her. "I'm trying to be better. You are." He took her hand, held it. And for the first time in a very long time, David let himself believe that maybe he wasn't just fixing what was broken. He was building something that had never existed before. The next morning, David stepped out into the cool autumn air. The frame stood tall now, waiting for walls. In the garden bed beside it, the green sprout was growing strong again, sturdy despite everything. Isabel had placed a small stake beside it, tied with a ribbon from her wedding dress, a marker, a prayer, a promise. David knelt beside it, brushed a fingertip along its stem. Not forever, not yet, but today. Today, they were still standing. 3. Weeks after the fire, the new home stood where the old one had burned. The siding wasn't perfectly level. One of the windows squeaked when it opened. The floor in the kitchen dipped just slightly to the left, enough that a marble would always roll toward the back door. But it was theirs. Ethan had helped paint the front steps, bright blue with streaks of green where he'd gotten bored and creative. Isabel had sewn new curtains, soft cotton and pale yellows, the color of early morning light. David had built a table from scrap wood and sanded it down until his palms blistered. "It's not the house I lost," he said, the first night they moved in. "It's better. Because no one gave this to me, we built it." The garden bed had started to bloom again. They didn't plant much, just some herbs, a few late-season carrots, a row of marigolds Ethan insisted would keep bad spirits away. But in the center stood the little sprout, taller now, leaves wide, a soft reddish hue at the tips. David had gone into town one morning and returned with a wooden stake, a plaque attached. "Promise tree. We don't promise forever, but we choose each other every day." When Isabel read it, she'd stood a long while in silence. Then she'd kissed him on the cheek and whispered, "That's all I ever wanted." Mornings settled into routine. David opened the garage. Isabel made breakfast and walked Ethan to school. They came home to a house that still smelled like sawdust and sunlight. Some nights the three of them played cards by candlelight. Some nights they sat in separate rooms wrapped in quiet, safe in the knowledge they didn't need to fill it. On Sundays they invited neighbors over for tea and muffins. Mrs. Hendricks always brought something sweet. Pastor June always brought something kind. Jason usually brought a question about cars he already knew the answer to. No one asked them to leave. No one asked how long it would last. They were simply allowed to stay. One afternoon a letter arrived. It bore the Millerton family crest. "David, read it on the porch, hand steady." It wasn't a lawsuit, just a thinly veiled warning cloaked in formality. A reminder that some people had power and some didn't. He folded the letter once, then twice, then burned it in the tin pail beside. The stairs. Isabel came out with 2 mugs of coffee, handed him one. "Anything important?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not anymore." They sat together on the step, shoulder to shoulder. "We're not safe forever," she said. "No," he agreed. "But we're safe enough." She looked at him. "That counts for something," he added. "It counts for everything." Fall deepened. The days shortened. The wind turned sharper. David pulled the garden bed in, covered the roots in mulch, wrapped the promise tree in burlap. "Will it survive winter?" Ethan asked one evening. David knelt beside him. "It might, if we keep taking care of it." "And if it doesn't?" David looked at the thin trunk, the small branches. "Then we'll plant another." Ethan thought about that, nodded solemnly, then said, "But I think this one's strong." David smiled. "Me too." That night after dinner, Isabel lit a candle on the center of the table. Ethan had drawn a picture of the house, the garden, and 3 stick figures holding hands. He taped it to the fridge, proud. David watched. Isabel moved through the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back. Not dressed up, not made up. Just real. He felt the words before he spoke them. "I thought I'd never feel this again," he said quietly. She turned, eyebrows raised. "What?" "This. A home. A we." She stepped toward him, took his hand. "You didn't find it," she said. "You built it." He pulled her close. "I love you, Isabel." She leaned into him. "I know. I love you too." They didn't make vows, no big ceremony, no rings. But one evening, under the wide Midwestern sky, the 3 of them stood in the garden and tied a ribbon around the promise tree. Isabel held one end, David the other. Ethan wrapped it in the middle. "We're not a perfect family," David said. Ethan nodded solemnly. "But we're a real one." And Isabel added softly, "And that's more than enough." As twilight fell, the house glowed, golden from within. The porch creaked, The wind rustled, and from the middle of the yard, where ash once covered everything, a tree stood, young, fragile, alive, and chosen. If this ending made you pause, or simply warmed something quiet inside you, leave a gentle like as a way of saying, "I felt that," and subscribe if you'd like to stay a little longer with us. Because sometimes, we don't have to promise forever. Just choose to show up, day by day. Thank you for listening. Wishing you a kind and peaceful day.